Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar with Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy and the Institute Center for the Middle East. My name is Colton Cox, and I am the Policy Assistant to Ambassador Edward Djerejian, the Director of the Baker Institute, who will be today's speaker. As we're all unfortunately aware, the nation of Lebanon was recently struck by a tragedy of enormous proportions that captured global attention and sympathy. The explosion of ammonium nitrate in the port of Beirut on August 4th left approximately 200 dead and thousands more injured, with countless buildings destroyed and wide swaths of citizens left homeless. Even more unfortunate was that this disaster came at a time when the Lebanese government and civil society were facing deep structural challenges. In this webinar, Ambassador Djerejian will discuss the overall dimensions of this crisis as well as its near and long-term consequences. Ambassador Djerejian's first diplomatic posting was actually to Beirut, where he served as a young political officer from 1965 to 1969. Since then, he has dealt with U.S. Middle East policy throughout his career and served under 8 different presidential administrations, from John F. Kennedy to Bill Clinton. Moreover, he continues to be heavily involved in a range of Middle East policy issues after his retirement from the Foreign Service and as director of the Baker Institute. Following the ambassador's remarks, he will be entertaining questions from the audience, and we encourage you all to submit questions throughout the course of the webinar using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screens. With that, I thank you all once again for joining us, and I will now hand it over to Ambassador Djerejian. Ambassador?
Thank you very much, Colton, and thank you all for attending this webinar on Lebanon. As you can see from the photos of the Beirut port, they depict more than words can the tragic decline of Lebanon as a nation state. The first is that of the port in the 1950s, and the second is that of the port after the horrendous explosion of August 4th that has brought Lebanon to a critical turning point in its history. I would like to outline the historic context of this devolution from the point of view of a former American diplomat who served in Lebanon, as Colton mentioned, in the 1960s, and have had many occasions to remain engaged in Lebanese affairs. And then I will discuss the current crisis in Lebanon and the challenges ahead. So Beirut was a living metropolis, a multi-confessional society of Christians, Muslims, and Jews at the crossroads of the Middle East. Virtually every political current in the Arab world was present in Beirut, and the city bustled with financial, intellectual, and cultural activity. East melded with the West, and the church and synagogue and a mosque coexisted in mutual order with the people of the book. There was a wide spectrum of political factions and parties from the left to the right that advocated their causes inside and outside the Lebanese parliament. So Beirut in the 1960s was also an important listening post, the center of politics, espionage, a microcosm of inter-Arab politics and of the Arab-Israeli conflict and of Cold War rivalries. The image of Beirut and Lebanon in the last of those best years was that of a tolerant country at relative ease with different cultures and religions. So one of Lebanon's distinctive features was the confessional system of government, which was initially introduced in the mid-19th century during the Ottoman Empire. It was reconfirmed in the National Pact of 1943 at the end of the French Mandate, when Lebanon achieved its independence, whereby Lebanon's largely Christian, Muslim, and Druze communities were apportioned their respective quota of seats in parliament based on the 1932 consensus, whereby the ratio of 6 to 5 Muslims, including the Druze, was put in place. Now, it's really a fascinating anecdote that given the implications of reapportioning political power based on this confessional diagram, no comprehensive census has been conducted in Lebanon since 1932. It would be politically too volatile to do so. So according to the confessional apportionment of positions, I think many of you know that the president of the republic is a Maronite Christian, the prime minister is a Sunni Muslim, the Speaker of the Parliament a Shia Muslim, and so on down the ranks of the political governmental order. The political bargain struck in the National Pact reflected a compromise between the Christians, who did not want to be engulfed in a larger Arab Muslim entity, certainly not by Syria, and the Muslims, who did not want Lebanon to be under the influence of Western, i.e., Christian powers. So while Lebanon was considered a model of multi-confessional coexistence, and on the surface, it seemed to work well, as a diplomat in the American embassy in Beirut, I rapidly grew to appreciate the fragility of the situation. My feeling was that if one scratched the surface, one would find lurking below a feudal and sectarian system ready to emerge and cause great harm. The country was on the edge of turmoil, even in those days, with demographic growth favoring the Muslim population, shifting political alignments, external interventions, including from Syria, Israel, France, US, and other external players, and prolonged conflict just over the horizon. So tragically, the beguiling image of Beirut was soon shattered as Lebanon became the victim of regional forces and its own internal political and confessional factions. The 1967 Arab-Israeli Six-Day War, in which Israel defeated the forces of the Arab countries arrayed against it, and seized a great deal of territory of its Arab neighbors, was a devastating blow to all Arabs and heightened anger toward the United States, which was Israel's key ally and supporter. Then, in the aftermath of Black September, a failed 1970 uprising against King Hussein of Jordan, which was highlighted by terrorist acts by the PFLP, thousands of Palestinians flooded into Lebanon from Jordan. The country subsequently became a base for the Palestinian Liberation Organization, prompting Israel to invade the country in 1982 to drive the PLO out, leaving much of Beirut in ruins. That date, 1982, and the Israeli invasion is one of those catalytic moments in Lebanon's history, from which stems many of the problems that we see today. This inflow of Palestinians altered the demographic composition of the country more in favor of the Muslims. And beginning in 1975, the country was torn for nearly 15 years by a civil war amongst its various religious and secular factions. In 1976, the Maronite Christian president, Sulaiman Frangieh, greatly concerned that the Muslims were going to win in the civil war, they would overrun the Christian forces, he appealed to Syria's president, Hafez al-Assad, to intervene and send military forces into Lebanon to help stabilize the situation. Now, Assad was only too happy to oblige because he wanted to consolidate Syria's grip over Lebanon. He never truly considered Lebanon to have the right to be an independent country. He considered Lebanon to be part of Greater Syria. So by 1989, when the internal fighting finally ended with the signing of the Taif Accords in Saudi Arabia, countless lives had been sacrificed. Beirut's image had been destroyed, the Lebanese system had crumbled, and a new word entered the political lexicon as intrastate conflicts elsewhere in the world came to be described as Lebanization. So sectarianism was entrenched after the Civil War. And according to our Rice professor, Osama Makdisi, in a recent tweet, he stated that sectarianism was entrenched after the Civil War. Warlords became politicians. They amnestied themselves. Maronite elites lost some power. Sunni and Shiite elites gained, yet they all conspired together to dominate post-war Lebanon with Syrian, Saudi, and US and other support. So given the turmoil of the times, and given what I mentioned, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, basically to occupy southern Lebanon, but when they went all the way up to Beirut, the Shiite movement, which was basically a moderate movement under their first leader, who I met at the time, the Imam Musa Sadr, turned into a militant organization, the Party of God that we know today as Hezbollah, and which aspired to transform Lebanon into an Islamic state modeled after Iran under the revolutionary government led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. So from its beginnings, Hezbollah has engaged in armed jihad and resistance and acts of terrorism to achieve its goals. So Hezbollah is a major factor not only in this history, but also in US relations, because they were behind the infamous bombing of our embassy in 1983 and the Marine barracks in 1983, where we lost many, many lives. So after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, Hezbollah emerged as one of the most powerful paramilitary forces in the region. They appealed to the call of resistance against Israel. Their leader, Hassan Nasrallah, appealed to Yasser Arafat not to negotiate with Israel because that was the wrong path. That he appealed to the PLO to take the path of Hezbollah, armed resistance. You'll get nothing at the negotiating table. Only resistance is the way forward. Now that's important because that is the raison d'etre, the reason for being of Hezbollah in Lebanon today as the only armed militia. So the only other organization in Lebanon that has the right to bear arms, other than the Lebanese armed forces, is Hezbollah. And that is a very important factor in the political scene in Lebanon. Then during this period, we had a series of assassinations and internal terrorist incidents in Lebanon. In February of 2005, Prime Minister Rafik Hariri, who tried to stake out a more independent path for Lebanon, especially from Syria, he was assassinated. The political confrontation that erupted after the elections in 2006 bifurcated into two basic groups. Those who identified themselves with Syria and Hezbollah, and those who identified themselves as a more independent grouping against Syria and Hezbollah. And this transformed itself, where going fast forward in 2016 presidential elections, the parliament was able to elect General Michel Aoun, who then nominated Saad Hariri, the son of the assassinated Prime Minister Rafik Hariri, as Prime Minister. So that's sort of the background, a very quick historic survey of the background to where we are today. Saad Hariri resigned in 2019 when the demonstrations started. You'll remember last year there were massive demonstrations from North to South Lebanon against the government corruption, dysfunction, and Saad Hariri's resignation that year started a lot of political competition for power. And the protesters have insisted on one thing: the ouster of not just the government, but the entire existing political class. Protesters have a clear message about who must go. They state all means all. The last prime minister, Hassan Diab, just a few days ago resigned after the port explosion in Beirut. So the clean sweep that the protesters demand would include the octogenarian President Aoun and Parliament Speaker Nabi Berri, along with the heads of political parties and the religious sects. And they want to see the installation of a new prime minister and a cabinet with no connections to any of those who for decades have controlled the state's coffers and have manipulated Lebanon's politics for their own private ends. So during the protests that began last year, demonstrators called for the president and parliament to appoint a technocratic government that could steer the country away from the traditional leaders and reform the electoral laws. Now, protesters have little faith or no faith in either the president or the leaders of these parliamentary blocs to appoint a truly independent government. And there isn't yet an agreed path forward on how a political transition in Lebanon would occur. So if a new independent leadership is put in place, they are calling for essential economic reforms, which would allow Lebanon to obtain IMF bailout and then set free and fair elections for the Lebanese to choose their next leaders. When you look at the way the ruling class, if you will, have apportioned power, there's one party, Sectarian party, that controls the Ministry of Electricity. For the last 10 years, they've controlled the Ministry of Electricity, and they siphon off all sorts of money for their own ends. Another party controls the port of Beirut, which is a large moneymaker for the economy of Lebanon. Another controls the telecom center. So they transformed these public service sectors and infrastructure into their own private property, and use these ministries for very corrupt ends. So August 4th, is it going to be a turning point in the history of Lebanon toward a positive end or a further devolution downwards? For 6 years, the authorities stored at the port of Beirut 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate, which is a chemical used in bombs, despite many warnings that this was not a good idea. It may have been heaped in a hangar along with other combustible materials, but up to 200 people were killed and at least 7,000 wounded. An estimated 300,000 people are homeless. Fixing the ruined city could cost estimates $15 billion, which is a quarter of Lebanon's GDP in 2019. The dead are still being buried, victims are still being treated, rubble is still being cleared. But over a week after the massive explosion at the port, which devastated much of the city's center, Lebanon's leaders have returned to their usual priority, self-preservation. As I said, the last prime minister, Hassan Diab, announced his resignation, but he lingers on now as a caretaker prime minister until the country's political leaders choose a replacement. The ruling political class is determined to escape blame for a disaster of their own making. And despite the horror, many Lebanese fear that they will succeed once again. So while politicians argue, citizens deal with the explosion's aftermath. I don't know if you saw the video footage of the young Lebanese, young and old volunteers thronging the streets of East Beirut, helping to clear the debris. There was no government out there. There were no fire trucks. There were no government ambulances. The army wasn't deployed to help in the cleanup. The volunteers, the Lebanese people themselves, took it upon themselves because the state doesn't exist for them. Universities sent teams of engineers to check the structural integrity of the damaged buildings. And the vast Lebanese diaspora, which is very important, there's a large Lebanese population, this diaspora here in the United States, has contributed money and materials. So cleaning up may be the easy part, but to rebuild will require money that Lebanon simply does not have. President Macron of France on August 9th visited Lebanon, but he raised collectively with other donors 253 million euros. That's about $297 million for healthcare, food, and other necessities. But a larger aid package will require political reforms of the sort that the Lebanese governments have failed to implement in the past. The IMF, which plays a key role in any bailout, has made clear that any IMF assistance has to be linked to changes, recapitalization of the banks, with the burden on shareholders and large depositors, a capital controls law, and an audit of the central bank, which the entrenched interests are resisting. One of the most recent decisions that the president of Lebanon made, he has given the army sweeping powers for a temporary period of time under a state of emergency, a 2-week state of emergency. And this allows the army to curb free speech, freedom of assembly and freedom of the press, as well as to enter homes and arrest anyone deemed a security threat. So in terms of security, that's one thing, but if the army is going to be used to stifle the protests and dissent, that's another. Now, let me turn quickly to the US position and summarize that. There are dual tracks in my view of the US position. One, we have a very close relationship with Lebanon over the years. We have given a great deal of assistance in the past to Lebanon. We have supported the Lebanese army in very meaningful ways in order to establish the army as the force of internal security and not Hezbollah, for example. David Hale, our Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, arrived in Beirut, and symbolically, a bit like what Macron did, instead of first meeting with the government officials, he went straight into the street where the volunteers were working with citizens who lost their homes. And his signal was clear. He came to listen, offer support, and reportedly, he was carrying a very tough message to the sectarian leaders, which was that without reform, no aid from the IMF or others would be likely. So he made clear that this was a time for political reforms, a truly independent technocratic government that will restore essential services, develop a vision for the country with key stakeholders, tackle corruption, and transparently adopt needed reforms to allow international aid to flow into the country. I think that's the right position. Secretary Pompeo enumerated the $403 million in US humanitarian assistance to Lebanon since 2019 and other assistance. But he did, the government is also, the US government is also making and hinting that they want Hezbollah to go, to remove itself from the political scene, which is an extremely difficult objective. So we don't know if the government, the US government, is going to impose more sanctions to get at Hezbollah, but how will that affect the whole restoration effort in Lebanon has yet to be seen. So let me summarize what the protesters are demanding. On the sectarian political system, which I gave you the historic overview of, they've gotten one thing already. They've got the resignation of the government. They want the formation of what they call a rescue cabinet. They want a new electoral law, and under which there'll be early parliamentary elections. And they want a transparent and productive public sector. On governance, they want an independent judiciary. They want to hold the corrupt accountable. They want to recover stolen funds stolen from the government. They want to establish the rule of law. Financially, I mentioned the economic rescue plan. They want to restructure the national debt, and they want to reform the banking sector. To talk nothing about on the social environmental demands, because Lebanon, believe it or not, this country, which was pristine when I was a young diplomat there, for years has been battling accumulated garbage in the streets because of the corruption involved in people who are making money off of garbage collection. And for years, they have been battling this pollution of accumulated garbage in the streets of these cities of Lebanon. The inefficient public services is one of the major goals of the protesters. So what are the major questions? The major questions in my eyes are, will the demands of the protesters prevail and lead to structural, political, and socioeconomic change in Lebanon? Or will the ruling political class reassert itself with the minimum they can get away with to retain their power and their privileges? This has often happened in the Arab world. We saw what happened during the so-called Arab Spring, what I call the Arab uprisings of 2011 and 2012, which started in Tunisia. And the ruling elites in Tunisia, in Egypt, in other Arab countries were overthrown as a result of this spontaneous popular unrest. But soon thereafter, except for Tunisia, the autocratic regimes reasserted themselves, the ruling class and the vested interests reasserted themselves. So the historic precedent there isn't great for Lebanon, but this is really one of the major challenges. So beyond their list of demands, which I enumerated, which I think are worthy goals, obviously, the protesters need to articulate a coherent political platform. And they have to identify leaders and establish political parties. If that is not done, these protesters may have the fate of what I mentioned has happened in the Arab uprisings and what has recently happened in Iraq or in Sudan or in Algeria. Now, this is not a zero-sum game. The power brokers in Lebanon, the feudal sectarian leaders, they do have a constituency. And that constituency is going to have to be engaged in whatever political transition is made in Lebanon, the so-called warlords. And that is going to be an extremely difficult dialogue. But the protesters, if they can organize themselves politically, should engage in a political platform that appeals also to the constituencies of the current ruling class. The other big question is how to deal with Hezbollah. Rami Khouri, who's a well-known author and commentator on Middle East affairs in Lebanon, he said, quote, "We might have entered a phase in Lebanon where effectively the two most powerful actors have emerged as Hezbollah and the massive, uncoordinated, but probably unstoppable protest movement, which wants to replace the current power structure with a more democratic and rule of law-based governance system." I think he's onto something there. This is going to be the major counterweight that we're going to witness in the days ahead. There are also these regional considerations. Lebanon has always been, if you will, the victim, either self-inflicted or inflicted by the outside powers who have intervened in Lebanese affairs. The Saudi Arabia, the UAE, the US, France, Israel. There are many countries who have their own agendas for Lebanon. And this is another factor in any approach to resolve Lebanon's problems. There has to be an international, hopefully coordinated foreign policy approach to rescuing Lebanon from its deep malaise. Ideally, more than any single factor in my mind, a comprehensive Arab-Israeli peace settlement will remove many of the negative forces at play both inside and outside of Lebanon that have exploited that country as a venue for proxy wars and conflicts. Ideally, again, a Lebanese-Israeli peace agreement would negate Hezbollah's role as a resistance force. If there's peace between the Arabs and Israel, Hezbollah's raison d'etre as an armed militia disappears overnight. So in conclusion, the future of Lebanon and the region is at stake. What happens in Lebanon is not going to stay only in Lebanon. We saw that in the Syrian civil war. What happened in Syria had implications throughout the region and in Europe and in transatlantic relations. If Lebanon devolves into a failed state, its people will be the first to pay the dire consequences, and Lebanon can become a base for terrorism and violence affecting its neighbors and beyond, including more refugee outflows. Also, if the situation devolves further, one cannot exclude another military confrontation between Hezbollah and Israel. The very model of a multi-confessional state in the heart of the Middle East will have been set asunder. It is up to the Lebanese people in the first instance and the international community in the second to prevent such destabilizing outcomes. The question, can Lebanon redefine its multi-confessional character, which is a positive attribute that Lebanon has been the foyer of Muslims, Christians, Jews, and others living together? Can it redefine its multi-confessional character into a viable nation state where the people identify with the nation and not primarily with their confessional base? That, in my view, should be the strategic objective of policy, both in Lebanon, for our country, and the international community. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Ambassador. And I'll start with a question touching on a theme you just mentioned about regional involvement in Lebanese affairs. So in November 2017, former Prime Minister Saad Hariri tendered his resignation from office while in Saudi Arabia, with many believing that this was done at the coercion of Saudi authorities. Now, even though, as you mentioned, Hariri would continue to serve and he finally resigned amidst the protest, what does this event tell us about regional powers, rivalries, and differing visions for Lebanon?
Well, that's a good question. That exemplifies the comment I made on outside powers' interests in Lebanese affairs. The Saudis are very concerned about Hezbollah's influence in Lebanon because Hezbollah is backed by Iran, which is one of the major adversaries of Saudi Arabia and the UAE and other Gulf countries. So the Saudis were very assertive in using their influence in a very open way by calling the sitting prime minister of Lebanon to Riyadh and basically dictating to him what the policy should be. The Israelis have tried their influence in Lebanon. The May 17th, 1983, the treaty failed miserably because they didn't take it. They wanted to bypass Syria's and other Arab countries in making peace with Israel. And Bashir Gemayel, the president, the Maronite president of Lebanon at that time, was negotiated with American support a peace treaty with Israel. Well, when the Syrian dictator Hafez al-Assad learned about that, he acted. Bashir Gemayel was assassinated. So you have all these outside powers that have influenced the internal dynamics of Lebanon. And the Saudi and the Israeli examples I gave you are just two of those.
I'll turn to another question about the demographic makeup of Lebanon. So we definitely cannot speak about Lebanese society as a whole without touching on the question of refugees. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees estimates that there are approximately 1.5 million refugees from Syria who've spilled over into Lebanon from the neighboring conflict. What are the challenges that have arisen from this small nation hosting such a large number of refugees? And what is the significance of Lebanon's place so geographically proximate to the Syrian conflict?
Well, the refugee issue has been a catalytic force in Lebanese internal politics. I mentioned during the Black September, when the PLO was exiled from Jordan and they went into Lebanon. All those Palestinians that went into Lebanon shifted the demographic base into favor slightly to the Muslims. This was a very destabilizing factor, which led to Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982. So that's one example of where refugee issues have incredibly important political outcomes and consequences. The Lebanese, to their great credit, have absorbed 1.5 million Syrian refugees, as you stated, because of the civil war in Syria. Amazingly, it's part of the dynamic of the Lebanese society. Many of those Syrians have found jobs, a lot in menial tasks and labor and construction, but they've absorbed a good number of them, but at the same time, they are refugees in a country that need help and assistance and can become a destabilizing force. Many of them are scared to go back to Syria because they feel that they will be imprisoned at best by the regime. And so that is a problem that's going to remain until there's some sort of stability in Syria and a political transition in Syria, which is, again, not over the horizon.
And Ambassador, as you've discussed, Lebanon has been marked by sectarian divisions and diversity throughout its history. With the recent resignation of the government of Hassan Diab, what do you believe are some of the challenges, and is there any hope for forming a government that can transcend these sectarian divisions?
As I mentioned, it's going to be very complex. And the ruling elites are going to try to hold on to as much power as they can in the next formation of a government and next steps toward reforms. The ability of the protesters, again, to form a political platform that can attract the majority of Lebanese including some of the constituencies of the ruling elite, and establish this concept of wataniya, of nationalism, that yes, I'm a Christian, I'm a Druze, I'm a Muslim, but I'm a Lebanese, I'm Lebanese. This is what will enable a political transition in Lebanon to a responsible government, but it's going to need electoral reforms. It's going to need the establishment of a secular government that recognizes the multi-confessional nature of Lebanese society, but that is a secular government. And it is going to have the power to root out the corruption and establish viable economic social programs. It's a high bar. It's very difficult for one to be optimistic, but these are the goals.
We have some questions coming in, and one of them addresses an event that's still very much unfolding that concerns Lebanon, and that is today's verdict from the Special Tribunal for Lebanon regarding the killing of former Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri 15 years ago. The tribunal implicated one member of Hezbollah specifically, but it did differentiate and note that there was no direct connection that they could find between Hezbollah leadership and the Syrian government in the attack. Could you speak very generally about the significance of this ruling and also how significant the assassination of former Prime Minister Hariri was 15 years ago?
Well, Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri, again, a Sunni Muslim, he sort of broke the mold and charted out a independent policy to restructure, redevelop Lebanon, and to distance Lebanon from Syrian hegemony. Again, Syria is aligned with Hezbollah. Hezbollah is aligned with Syria. Syria is aligned with Iran. Hezbollah is aligned with Iran. So it was a dangerous path that he stepped into, and he was assassinated. The International Criminal Court, as you mentioned, came to the verdict that they didn't have any direct evidence of Syrian direction of this assassination, nor were they able to have direct evidence of Hezbollah's leadership. But the people on trial, the 5 on trial, they are all Hezbollah persons, members of Hezbollah. So Hezbollah obviously had a hand in this assassination. I heard from Lebanese friends that they were very concerned about what the verdict would be, because if the verdict came out and pointed to, for example, the leadership in Syria, the leadership of Hezbollah in Lebanon, that could bring people out into the streets and that could just cause more chaos and more violence. I don't know how this verdict is going to translate itself in terms of the street. We'll see that in the next few days. But it's a sad commentary. So many Lebanese leaders have been assassinated. It had become endemic. But the Hariri verdict is going to still play out in this political transition we're looking at in Lebanon. And I think it all comes down to this basic dichotomy between what this protest movement is asking and the entrenched interest with Hezbollah as the most powerful party in that group.
Ambassador, we have another question talking about the financial situation in Lebanon. And as you've discussed, there are many structural issues with the financial sector in Lebanon. We also know that at one point it was the financial hub of the Middle East. It was Beirut was dubbed the Paris of the Middle East. It was a flourishing city of commerce. Could you speak more to some of how this downward spiral happened in terms of the strength of Lebanon's financial sector to where it is today, asking for loans from the IMF?
Well, unfortunately, you're absolutely right. It was a financial hub of the whole Middle East. It had a very vibrant banking sector. It had investment groups. It was truly an international financial center, especially for the Middle East. Over the years, as I explained, with the systemic corruption coming into place and the civil war, with the warlords really taking upon themselves the control of ministries, they also obviously were able to gain a great deal of influence over the banking sector in Lebanon. So there was a lot of non-transparency in the banking sector, which led to the very important factor in the financial demise of the country. And private accounts, deposits that unaccounted for, people then finding out that they couldn't take their money out of their bank accounts because it wasn't there. So the banking sector fell prey to the systemic corruption of the whole establishment. The Lebanese pound devalued considerably, whereby it's almost worthless, became almost worthless. So in terms of the economy, I think Lebanon can always spring back, but it can only be done under the aegis of structural economic and political reforms, as Macron stated, as David Hale stated on behalf of the international community. But you have to have something to lean on to make those reforms. And this prior structure political class, you couldn't lean on them because they would lean only so far and would not be willing to enact structural economic fiscal reforms that would then allow the international community, the IMF, the World Bank, and international donors to come in with a rescue package.
And tying into this, we have a number of questions asking to build upon what you've said about protesters being able to coalesce, identify leadership, and translate that momentum into political action. Someone points out that in a nation that does deal with endemic corruption and fundamentally a lack of rule of law itself, what can some of the key messages of these protesters be? How can they rally others to their cause, and how can they translate their protests into more action towards social reform?
Well, it's a very good question, and that is the dilemma, how they can actually translate that into specific actions that move the country in a more positive direction. I think, as I've outlined, the demands are pretty clear. And they're right on the mark. Many Lebanese agree on the demands of the protesters. But demands of themselves are not enough. And so they're going to have leaders emerge from themselves. And this is easy to say, but very hard to do. But new leaders have to emerge that will then translate these demands into a national political agenda, a platform upon which they can attract the support of the majority of the Lebanese people from all confessions and from all the demographics of the Lebanese country. That's a high bar. And again, if the example of the Arab uprisings displays or guides us, and many times it doesn't succeed, except in Tunisia. So one can only hope that out of this protest movement, these leaders and a political platform and political parties and organizations can emerge. But if you ask me, who are those leaders? I do not know. And I think if you ask many Lebanese, they would be hard-pressed to say, so-and-so is this leader, so-and-so is that a leader. They've been living so long under this confessional sectarian system of not only warlords, but oligarchs who run their fiefdoms in the country, that young, promising, creative people have been stifled to even enter politics. They are there. The Lebanese people are among some of the most creative, innovative people I have ever met in my life. And they have the wherewithal to bring their country back. But they have to be given the opportunity. but they have to also seize the opportunity along the lines I've outlined.
We have other questions asking for some more details on the situation with Hezbollah. As you've outlined, there are definitely popular voices dissenting against Hezbollah. We saw in some of the protests that there were cutouts of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah hung in effigy. And the question we have here now is, what also is the Iranian factor involved in this, with the common Shiite ideology and revolutionary ideology and patronage over the years from Iran? How does Iran play into maintaining Hezbollah's strength domestically?
Well, Iran, that's a good question. Iran plays a major hand in maintaining Hezbollah. Hezbollah is an independent Shiite movement in Lebanon, but it is heavily sponsored and supported by the Ayatollah regime in Iran. The regime in Iran looks at Hezbollah as one of its most important proxies in the Middle East. If you look at Iranian policy in the region, this so-called Iranian Shiite arc from Tehran through Baghdad, through Damascus to Beirut, it's not a territorial arc, but it's an arc of proxy influence. The Iranians have the provisional militias in Iraq that are their agents, and they wield a great deal of political influence in Iraq. The Bashar al-Assad's regime in Damascus is heavily dependent on Iranian support. And in Beirut, they have Hezbollah. So they're not going to give up on Hezbollah lightly. And they tout Hezbollah's banner of resistance against Israel as justifying their support for Israel, for Hezbollah in the Arab-Israeli conflict. It gives them a very good propaganda tool to say that they are more militant against the occupation of Arab territories and the Palestinian issue than many Arab countries are. So this is the politics that the Ayatollahs in Tehran play. So I do not see them giving up easily on supporting Hezbollah. But Hezbollah does have a certain amount of independence of action because, as I mentioned, in its origins, it was an outcome of the destabilization of the south of Lebanon after the Israeli invasion of '82. The Shiites were the great dispossessed people of Lebanon. They were the poor of the poor. And Hezbollah was able to translate this all into obtaining great popular support in the streets and the rural areas as a resistance force, then translated into a political force in Lebanese politics. So Iran's role in Lebanon is they are not going to look for an exit strategy at this point.
And Ambassador, we have a number of questions touching on Israel and the Arab-Israeli conflict, such as the new agreement between the UAE and Israel. But while we don't have the bandwidth to discuss these larger Arab-Israeli conflict themes, could you speak a bit more very targeted about the situation on the northern border with Israel? There's, of course, a history of conflict between Hezbollah that you've just alluded to with Israel there, and what this one heated conflict might imply for the future of both countries.
Well, when I served in Israel as the American ambassador and after in my current capacity directing the Baker Institute, I've had several trips to Israel. And I've always been struck by, in my discussions with Israeli military intelligence, IDF, Israeli politicians, how often the northern border would come up. Because in Israeli eyes, the northern border is a potential serious threat against the Israeli state, because Hezbollah is not only heavily armed, it's not only a heavily armed militia, but it possesses thousands of missiles and rockets, which over the years have extended their range. In the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, it was a devastating war for both sides, but the Israelis suffered in that war. And in the interim, Hezbollah has stockpiled more missiles. So now it has a range where it could strike near, and I believe some missiles could strike south of Tel Aviv. So the Israelis are constantly renewing their contingency military planning for a confrontation on the northern border. I think they consider that a more serious threat than Hamas in the south. So this is an issue that prevails today. And I haven't looked into this directly with our Israeli contacts, but I'm sure that the contingency planning is being dusted off the shelves right now, because I'm pretty sure that the Israelis are thinking, if Hezbollah is squeezed politically in Lebanon and Hassan Nasrallah's back is against the wall, or if he's seen as being outbidded by the protests, he may opt for a foreign adventure, like some action against Israelis or Israeli territory, in order to garner popular support that Hezbollah is fighting the Zionist enemy, as they put it in their terms. So this has become a more serious threat as a result of the implosion of the political state of affairs in Lebanon.
And Ambassador, we have a number of questions that tie the discussion back into the immediate aftermath of this blast, and specifically, how should foreign nations who want to aid Lebanon go about this? We've seen, as you mentioned, leaders from France and the US have come and gone directly to the people who were most affected. They've said they want to bypass some of the political system. And there are also those protesting who fear that if aid is given into the wrong hands, it could ultimately exacerbate some of the structural difficulties. So what should foreign powers who would like to aid Lebanon keep in mind in terms of the best practices for implementing that aid?
I think it's really important that the international community band together on this, so that you don't have one country aiding this group or that charitable organization, another country aiding that one, and it's not coordinated, not harmonized. I think the goal of the whole international community, be it the US, France, Arab countries, whoever, that maybe the UN should be the focal point of a coordinated international economic assistance and development package for Lebanon. And one of the key goals should be assuring that the assistance gets to the people and to the projects that can help restore the country, and not be filtered through the corrupt ruling class, which quite frankly will siphon off a sizable amount of the proceeds for their own personal fortune. Again, that's easier said than done, but it can be done. But it should be done in a coordinated manner. I think if it's done piecemeal, the prospects for the corruption of the end use of the development and economic funds will reemerge. So the first step is, and the UN should really step up to the plate on this, I think, and coordinate an international assistance package and establish on the ground the entry points of where this assistance can be delivered. Again, the Lebanese people are very resourceful. I'm sure a lot of these young protesters can organize agencies and groups to absorb assistance. They have to be identified. They're really, they could be the new NGOs of Lebanon. So that's what I would recommend.
Thank you, Ambassador. Unfortunately, we only have time for one final question, but this will be a broad question and also a personal one for you. If you could touch more on your memories of your time in Beirut, both as a young political officer and throughout the years, and just how deeply this terrible explosion affected the history of Beirut. So much history was also destroyed in the process. And really, if you could just reflect on the arc of Lebanon's history and how this blast will play into that.
Well, it's very painful personally, because if you lived and worked in Lebanon, you have many Lebanese friends. When you've seen Lebanon, that brief period of time I mentioned in the 50s and the 60s, leading up to the 67 war, when things started to go asunder, and then the terrible Lebanese civil war of 75 to 90, 1975 to 1990, when the whole country was torn asunder. But when you were able to experience that moment, and it wasn't pristine. I don't want anyone to misinterpret what I'm saying. It was, as General de Gaulle in 1965 said, Lebanon is an independent, sovereign, prosperous, and cultivated country. And he was right at the time, as a snapshot. But as a young American diplomat working in a political section, I remember we wrote a telegram back to Washington saying, while Lebanon is faring pretty well along the lines I just mentioned, if you scratch the hand of Lebanon, you may quickly find underneath the skin a feudal, oppressive order. So we recognized that the fragility of the confessional system, but at that time it was working because there wasn't the systemic corruption that we have today. And Lebanon had not gone, it had gone through turmoil. We sent Marines to Lebanon in 1958. They were greeted on the beaches of Lebanon by ladies in swimming suits and ice cream vendors. It was one of the, we really didn't need to invade it, but Lebanon has always been a point of turmoil, even in American diplomatic history. But the fragilities were there, and they were exacerbated by everything that happened afterwards, as I explained. So it is very painful to know what it was and what it could become again. We had a very good friend, Ghassan Twaini, who is the publisher of An-Nahar, one of the most respected papers in Lebanon and the Arab world at the time. And he told me once, he said, Ed, if multi-confessionalism cannot work in Lebanon, it will not be able to work anywhere in the Middle East. And I think that's what's really at stake. Because remember, the Middle East is still a multi-ethnic entity. And Lebanon was the prime example of multi-confessional existence. So if we can get back to that point where you have a mosque, synagogue, and church and other groups coexisting under a national state system, I think that earlier model of Lebanon can reemerge. But it is very painful to see what's happening now. And I think every effort has to be made for us to see what we can do to help the Lebanese get onto the path of reforms and reconstruction. And that's why, as you mentioned, Colton, the Baker Institute will be initiating a program in our Center for the Middle East on Lebanon in the weeks and months ahead.
Well, thank you, Ambassador, for this comprehensive overview and also your own personal insights. And I will echo what you just said. We had a number of questions on a range of issues salient to the Middle East, going deeper into the Lebanese question, the Arab-Israeli conflict, refugees. And I will note that the Baker Institute will continue to be studying these issues. You may visit the Baker Institute website, www.bakerinstitute.org, to find the most recent research on this. And certainly we will be studying the issue of Lebanon more deeply in a program, because as you've shown today, it is very much a crux issue for the Middle East. So we thank you all for joining us this evening, and also our thoughts go out to those in Beirut who were affected by this tragedy. Thank you all.
Thank you.